Airplane mechanical issues? No problem. A 19-point blown lead? No problem. The Sacramento Kings overcome more than just basketball odds in San Antonio, defeating the Spurs, gaining ground in the Western Conference, one game on the 12th spot. Well, progress is progress. On today's Locked On Kings podcast, we'll talk about Darren Fox's great game. We'll talk about the weird journey for Sacramento from New Orleans to San Antonio. So much good stuff. I'll tell you what went wrong in this game, why the Kings blew their 19-point lead, and what they were able to do in the final few minutes to secure this victory. It's all in today's episode of the Locked On Kings podcast.
You are Locked On Kings, your daily Sacramento Kings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that time for another episode of Locked On Kings.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Kings, your podcast hub for Sacramento Kings coverage all regular season and all off season. If you're looking for in-depth analysis, game-by-game breakdowns, highlights, interviews with local and national experts, full coverage of your Sacramento Kings from January through December, this is the place for you, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And I am your host, Matt George. I've been a Sacramento Kings media member for the last 7 years. This is my 8th season covering Kings basketball. I currently work for ABC 10 News and Television in Sacramento. And it's nice to talk about a victory. Technically, the Kings have won 2 out of their last 3. So let's focus on that. Let's spin it that way and not talk about the fact that the Kings have won only their 24th game. And yeah, they have they won their 24th game and have 41 losses. I almost gave them 2 games back. It's been a rough road to say the least. And of course, the Kings were coming off of a very difficult, disappointing blowout loss at the hands of the New Orleans Pelicans less than 24 hours ago, a game in which we know how important that was for the Kings and their race for the play. And the Spurs game was important too, not nearly as important as last night's game was. The Kings failed to do that. And then on the second night of a back-to-back, it's rough when you're taking on a team that still has something to play for, like San Antonio does, who's also trying to make up ground in the standings, who is rested when the Kings aren't. And Sacramento looked significantly better. Now, they did blow a 19-point lead, and I'll tell you why that 19-point lead evaporated so quickly, what went wrong between the first half and that third quarter, which of course is the third quarter when the Kings fell apart again. But before we even get to this game, we have to talk about what happened after the New Orleans game between that point and tip-off in San Antonio, because last night ended up being quite a wild night for the Kings in New Orleans, and it's not because they were enjoying Mardi Gras festivities. Typically, on road trips, after you complete a game in a city, it's pretty rare if you go back to the team hotel and then fly out the next day, even if you don't have a game the next day. Typically, you go right to the airport after a game and you fly into the next city and then have as many days there as you have before your game. And that wasn't the case. Why? Because the Kings basically sat at the arena in New Orleans, the Smoothie King Center, twiddling their thumbs and waiting for mechanical issues with their airplane in New Orleans. And they waited until actually 1:30 in the morning before it was decided that the flight would be delayed until the following day, today. So the Kings went back to their hotel in New Orleans, apparently got back around 2 o'clock in the morning, had a quick night, a short night's rest, got on a plane this morning, landed in San Antonio, had, I guess, like an hour or 2 to themselves, and then had to get on the bus and head to the arena in San Antonio to play their game. Now, they didn't apparently have a shoot-around. Alvin Gentry decided to cancel their shoot-around just to give them time to rest, which I think was the right call. And in reality, the Kings came into this game, second night of a back-to-back, after a tough loss against a rested team, like I already talked about, mechanical failures. I mean, they had a whole laundry list of excuses that they could have used. And quite honestly, I came into I sat down on my couch watching this game, not preparing to use those excuses myself on Locked On Kings, but to talk about why, in the grand scheme of things, those excuses aren't valid. And I'm glad that I don't have to talk about them. I'm really glad that we don't have to use these as an excuse. And I'm proud to see how the Sacramento Kings started this game and finished this game with everything that they went through. I'm not diminishing the fact that waiting until 2 o'clock in the morning to find out if you're going to be on a flight or not, and then getting a short night's rest, and then flying into a city and having a game that same night that you land. I can't even imagine how stressful, how frustrating, how exhausting that can be. Just normal travel anywhere is plenty tiring. So I'm not going to pretend to be in the Kings players' shoes and say that it wouldn't have been a valid excuse for them. But I liked that immediately coming out of the gate, you saw that the Kings were playing with an energy that suggested that they were the rested team. And I'm not saying San Antonio looked like they had been on the second night of a back-to-back, but the Kings didn't show signs of what they had gone through over the last 12 or so hours. They looked pretty solid, very, very solid, I thought. They were moving the ball well. And what I liked about it is, especially when it comes to Darren Fox, and I'm going to talk about his game a lot in the next segment, the Kings looked smooth. They looked confident. The word that I was that kept coming into my brain until the third quarter was composed. There was a lot of composure for the Sacramento Kings, especially to start this game. The ball movement was excellent. Off-ball cuts were good. The Kings were hitting outside shots. They got off to a good shooting start, similar to how they got in New Orleans, except they were able to sustain it and maintain it through that entire first half. But what I liked the most, as good as the offense was, as fun as the offense was to watch, defensively, the Kings looked really solid. They didn't do anything totally different. They were just contesting shots, forcing the Spurs into tough spots. Now, Lonnie Walker was having a fantastic game, did have a fantastic game, had an excellent first half, but with the exception of him, they weren't getting beat by anyone. Jakob Poeltl was struggling. DeJounte Murray, who we know is an incredibly talented player, he didn't look better than De'Aaron Fox. He didn't look like he was on his way to his 13th triple-double. The Kings defensively as a whole made life difficult for San Antonio. And it was for me refreshing to see a team that had all the excuses on the planet not playing like they had those excuses. And that led to them building a 19-point lead early on in the third quarter. They led by either 12 or 14 at half, I believe, allowed just 51 points in the first half, which I absolutely love to see. And in the first 2 or so minutes of the third quarter, they were able to extend that lead to 19. Unfortunately, it became a downward spiral from that point on. Dave Deuce Mason tweeted this out, and it gives you an idea kind of the story of this game. Domantas Sabonis was checked out of the game with 5 minutes and 46 seconds remaining in the third quarter. Now, by this point, San Antonio had managed to knock that 19-point lead down to around 14 or 12. So they kind of erased the good start to the third quarter that the Kings put together. So it's not that as soon as Sabonis came out, this game completely fell apart, but it sort of did. Kings were up 80-67 when Sabonis checked out of the game with 5:46 remaining in the third. Heading to the fourth quarter, the Kings' lead was only 6 points, 88-82. That just goes to show how important Sabonis is to this team. And this is on a night where Sabonis did have another double-double, but he was not very good. I'll talk about individual performances. I'll talk about Sabonis more in the next segment. But what changed for the Kings? It wasn't just that Sabonis wasn't in the game. It wasn't just that Sabonis was in foul trouble. What changed for the Kings, I looked at and wrote down 3 major things that I noticed that were different between the first, let's say, 26 minutes of this game and then the final 8 or so minutes of that third quarter. Number one is the Kings started missing shots, which is exactly what happened in the second half in New Orleans when they only scored, 34 points or something like that in that second half. Shots weren't falling. And what I liked to see in this game, there were stretches where I didn't see this, but for the most part, compared to the New Orleans game, the Kings weren't just settling for outside shots. When their shots stopped falling and they were hitting a decent amount of outside shots, they were getting good looks from the perimeter all game long. When they stopped falling, the Kings tried to work the ball inside more. But that led to another major difference in that third quarter, and that was the Kings stopped taking care of the basketball. As a whole, Sacramento finished with 15 turnovers. You want that number to basically be around 13 or less at the most each game. So 15 is definitely too high, and unfortunately, the Spurs were able to score 17 points off of those turnovers. the Kings stopped taking care of the basketball. They got a little sloppy around the paint. The ball movement, the passing wasn't nearly as crisp. And that's kind of the third thing that I noticed. Sacramento's ball movement dropped off. The Kings were still getting good looks, but they weren't as many good assisted looks. Of course, the assists drop off when shots aren't falling. Defensively, honestly, I thought that the drop off wasn't that steep. Like I thought the Kings were, with the exception of guarding Lonnie Walker, who was just having a fantastic game. I thought defensively the Kings were pretty consistent in this game. Now, that doesn't mean they were consistently good, but they were fine. They were solid. They got good moments. They were getting out in transition at times. They were forcing the Spurs into a lot of contested shots, and that never really changed. San Antonio was able to get out in transition a little bit more in that third quarter, thanks to them getting stops on the other end of the floor, which we didn't see too much in the first half with the Kings hitting as many shots as they did. But as a whole, Sacramento shot 46% from the field. That number was above 50 with much of the first half. Still too low of a three-point shooting percentage and too many three-point attempts, in my opinion. Now, a lot of these looks, again, are good looks that they're getting in the flow of the offense because of how much attention the Kings and how much pressure, really, the Kings put on the paint with Fox, Barnes, and Sabonis. But the Kings shooting 10 of 32 from three-point range, that's not good enough. Now, I love to see the Kings getting to the free throw line as many times as they did. 32 trips to the line, hit 27 of them for 84%. Number could be higher, but I'm never going to complain about 27 made free throws, and that was a major difference in this game as well. And thankfully, defensively, the Kings locked down, and I would say, honestly, won this game because of their defense late. Like, as soon as the Spurs took their first lead with, I think, around 5 minutes remaining in the game, the Kings blew their 19-point lead. Officially, the game was tied at about the 6 or 7 minute mark in the fourth quarter. Both teams went back and forth a little bit. The Spurs, I don't think, ever led by more than 2 points, if I'm mistaken. Sorry, they led by 4 points. And then the Kings put on a little bit of a run. They threw Domantas Sabonis back into the game with 5 fouls. He unfortunately did foul out, but not before making a couple big plays alongside Darren Fox. Some good two-man game moments between the two of them. And then the Kings defensively were able to hold on to win this game, even though DeJounte Murray hit a ridiculous three to get it to within one possession and then had another three with a chance to tie the game. Thankfully, he missed. That would have been the ultimate Kangs finish for him to find a way to tie that game and send it to overtime, which the Kings would have for sure lost. But thankfully, we didn't have to worry about that scenario. Now, maybe there are some of you listening that wish that scenario did take place, because I know a lot of Kings fans at this point in time are aware that the likelihood of the play-in is significantly low and are probably rooting for draft lottery odds. Well, if I'm looking at the draft lottery odds after tonight's game, it wasn't affected that significantly. They're now, instead of 2 games, I guess, ahead, but really back of the Indiana Pacers, who have the best odds of the 5th seed or 5th pick, and the Kings have the best odds of the 6th pick. They're now 2.5 games back. But they are still a full game ahead of the San Antonio Spurs, who are in the 7th seed. And again, the Kings made up a game on the San Antonio Spurs in the Western Conference standings. If the Kings were to leapfrog the Spurs, they would lose a spot in the draft lottery to the Spurs. And I know a lot of Kings fans are rooting against that. But in reality, this win tonight didn't have that drastic of an effect on the Kings draft lottery odds and percentages. They're still in the exact same spot and only go a half a game further away from a top 5 pick. But let's talk about the individual performances in this game. Darren had another very good game, in my opinion. He was absolutely distributing, maybe the best I've ever seen him pass the basketball. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Domantas Sabonis with another double-double, but in reality, it was not a very impressive one. In fact, it might be his worst double-double of the season, and he's had a lot of them. We'll talk about all that and then some when we come back after I tell you about Bet Online. If you have Kings knowledge, and I know you do, because the Sacramento Kings fan base is one of the most knowledgeable in all of professional sports. And I've said it as a joke, but it's also kind of true. If Kings fans had run the team, or at least the vocal Kings fans on social media, if they had run the team versus some of the basketball decisions that the Kings have made in the last 15 years, Kings might have been in a better spot and at least probably would have made a playoff series. I don't know. It's also good that fans don't run a team. It's good that I don't run a team because I can't even win a championship on NBA 2K. But you can use your knowledge to make money by understanding how Kings games are going to go and betting on what you think is going to happen by using Bet Online. Football season is over, but basketball is in full swing. Both pro and college hoops going on right now. From the latest odds, totals, player performance props to where the next coach is going to land, betonline.net is the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs. Bet Online remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball, of course. betonline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action at BetOnline, where the game starts. If you listened to yesterday's Locked On Kings podcast, the disappointing podcast after the Kings' 30-point loss to the New Orleans Pelicans, you probably remember me saying that I wasn't really throwing blame at any one person. I wasn't overly disappointed with Fox's performance or Domantas Sabonis's performance, despite the fact that they're the two best players who were on the losing side of a blowout in a game that had significant play-in implications. The biggest game of the season for the Kings. Fox and Sabonis, of course, could have done better, but I wasn't really too down on either guy. I did have criticisms for both guys, and the biggest issue and disappointment I had with Darren Fox's game, because he had a good offensive performance in terms of scoring the basketball against the Pelicans, but his assist numbers plummeted again. He had back-to-back games before the Pelicans game where he had 10 assists, and then he had just 3 assists in the loss to the Pelicans. Even though he had a major scoring role in that game, his assist numbers dropped off significantly. The good news is, in this game, in this win against San Antonio, not only did the Kings get that scoring that they expect out of Darren Fox with 26 points, they got 9 assists out of him. They had 3 assists to match his total for the Pelicans game in the first 5 or so minutes of this game. Fox was distributing really, really well. Now, what is a good indication of how this game went in the second half is the fact that Fox had 8 assists at halftime and finishes with just 9 assists for the game. Only 1 assist in the second half. That's not great. And that just goes to show you how offensively the Kings kind of ran into a wall a little bit. They weren't getting as many good looks that Fox was creating in the second half that they were getting in the first half. But I thought Darren did a phenomenal job reading the offense. And this is where I say that Fox looked like he was gliding a little bit. And I understand that people sometimes use that as a criticism against Fox. Well, he's not moving at 100%. Sometimes just like he looks like he's going with the flow of the game. Well, what I saw from Darren was he was going with the flow of what defenses were giving him. He was using his speed to get to the rim. Sometimes he would try and finish, and he was clobbered at the rim multiple times tonight. And poor guy struggled to get to the foul line, even though he did get 5 free throws, went 4 or 5. He should have been there 7, 8 times, at least in my opinion. But it was almost slow motion decision making where Fox was getting to his spots, and instead of going for like his patented mid-range jumper or a floater in the lane, he instead elected to throw a lob for a Damian Jones oop or kick out to the corner where Dante DiVincenzo is waiting for the ball. Fox's decision making in this game they were smooth, they were crisp, and they were natural. And it reminded me, now stay with me here, because this is comparing someone to the best of the absolute best here. It reminded me of a Chris Paul game, because when I watch Chris Paul play, Paul doesn't wow you with his incredible handles and bursts of speed. It's very different watching Chris Paul attack and Chris Paul play versus like Kyrie Irving, right? Kyrie has the fantastic dribbling, the oohs and ahs of the crowd, the fancy ways to get to his spots. Chris Paul just kind of methodically, like he's playing chess, works his way to his spots. He finds the open man and executes a very impressive pass that few can do. That was kind of the game that I saw from Darren. And even when Chris Paul scores, it's in the flow. Chris doesn't really, now he can, and he has done this before, but overall, if you watch Chris Paul play, he's not really doing a bunch of ISO step back, James Harden-esque moves to get his own shot. That's what I saw out of Darren Fox in this game. I saw Fox taking what the defense was giving him, picking his spots, attacking and scoring when he needed to or wanted to, and kicking out and opening the game up for his teammates when he needed to. And really, he looked to get his teammates more involved, then get his own numbers, get his own points to start this game, which was very different from how he started the New Orleans Pelicans game. And he ended up still with relatively similar scoring numbers. And it opened up Fox's game. It made life easier for Fox that he was able to get his teammates involved. He wasn't even the leading scorer in this game. Harrison Barnes was the leading scorer with 27 points. He had a very efficient game in 38 and a half minutes. The problem is Harrison's the leading scorer and he only takes 8 shots. I don't know how to turn a 27-point, 75% shooting from the field game into a negative, but it sounds like I'm trying to do that. I need him to shoot more, especially when he goes 4 of 5 from 3-point range. Now, where the majority of Barnes's points came was from the foul line. For the second straight game, Harrison did a great job getting to the line, or maybe it was the OKC game where he got to the line a lot. Regardless, recently, Barnes has been doing a great job fighting through contact and getting to the foul line, and he's been hitting there. He went 11 of 14 from the free throw line. I'm not saying that Harrison Barnes needs to be a volume shooter for this Kings team, but you need him to take more than 8 shots, especially when you have Justin Holiday taking 17. And look, I'm a fan of Justin Holiday. He had a stretch in this game where he was shooting well. He finished with 12 points. Anytime you can get double digits from Justin Holiday, it's a win. But 17 shots is way too many shots. 2 of 12 from 3-point range, rough. Very rough. And a lot of them are good looks that, quite frankly, he has to start hitting. And I've seen a lot of Kings fans starting to discuss whether or not it would be in the best interest of the Kings to replace Justin Holiday in the starting lineup with Dante DiVincenzo, who off the bench in just under 30 minutes had an 11.3 of 9 performance, going 2 of 6 from 3-point range. Offensively, he wasn't the best. Defensively, we know that what he provides. Justin Holiday is not bad defensively either, although I would say DiVincenzo is the better defensive player out of the two. So I think that's something that Alvin Gentry has to consider. But I will say, too, Justin Holiday is getting his looks in the flow of the offense. I didn't see Holiday really forcing anything. But if they're open, especially if you're getting them off of feeds from Sabonis and Fox, who draw so much attention, you got to hit those shots. Barnes was hitting the shots tonight. Holiday wasn't. Domantas Sabonis got his, I think, 42nd double-double of the season. Incredibly impressive. This might have been his worst double-double of the year. 12 points, 12 rebounds, 6 assists, fouled out of the game with 6 personal fouls, turned the ball over 4 times. He went 5 of 8 from the field. Again, only 8 shots from both Barnes and Sabonis isn't nearly enough. And the 3 misses that Sabonis had were pretty good gimmies around the rim that we normally see him hit. Sabonis's decision-making wasn't the best in this game. And he never really got into a flow because he got into foul trouble. But I thought he never really looked comfortable. Thankfully, the play of Darren Fox and Harrison Barnes, the Kings were able to overcome that. But boy, did this game get ugly at times, and the Kings made things scary. I also have to give a shout out to Damian Jones. I thought he played very well in the minutes that he had to pick up because Sabonis was in so much foul trouble. Richaun Holmes was a game-time decision in this game. Did not end up playing. I think it's the 4th straight game or 5th straight game, something like that he's now missed with his injury. But Damian Jones, once again, coming off the bench and just being reliable, just continuing to give you what he gives you. 5 of 5 from the field, 7 rebounds, a couple of assists. Damian Jones was great in this game, I thought. Exactly what you need out of your backup big, who is not going to challenge Richaun Holmes for minutes in my mind when Richaun does come back, but there's a better chance of Jones being on this Kings team next season than there is Richaun Holmes, at least in my opinion. And you know, I've already talked in the past here on Locked On Kings about the value that I think Richaun Holmes has and the likelihood of the Kings trading Richaun come next season. So what's next for the Kings? Well, their schedule is about to get really rough. I went over it in yesterday's Locked On Kings podcast. I'll give you a brief refresher before we wrap up. And I also want to hear from you, hear your thoughts on this Kings game. I'll let you know how you can reach out to me and get involved there. I'll do that after I tell you about Rock Auto. And look, I'm guessing 99.9% of my audience knows more about cars than I do. It doesn't take much to know more about cars than I do. I am absolutely brainless when it comes to cars. So when I first was approached over a year ago about rockauto.com and having Rock Auto be a sponsor of the Locked On Kings podcast, I was like, oh God, I hope that they don't have me talk about anything mechanical with my car, because I'll sound like a bigger idiot than I normally do with my Kings takes half the time. Well, thankfully, rockauto.com is as simple to talk about as it is to use and understand, because rockauto.com is made for people like me who have no idea what cars are, helps me save money, just as much money as the car geniuses out there who don't want to be pigeonholed into price points and part brands that only their local auto parts store carries. rockauto.com, it's basically the Amazon of auto parts shopping. You go to their website, you look at all their brands, you look at all the parts. There is nothing that they haven't had that I've heard of at this point in time. And you can save 30, 50, or even 100% more than if you go to your local chain auto parts store or your local dealership. Absolutely, for sure. And rockauto.com is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Their prices are reliably low for every customer. They don't change the price based off what you need and how experienced you are. You're not going to get tricked or anything like that. And they have so many parts for you, from brake parts to tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. They have it all. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or your truck. Right, Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Don't worry, draft lottery odds fans. The Kings schedule is still very much on your side. Even if you're frustrated with the Kings getting their 24th win of the season tonight, it might be a while before they get win number 25. Here's their upcoming schedule. The Kings will wrap up their road trip on Saturday. Hopefully they don't have traveling issues to Dallas, but thankfully they have a full day off tomorrow, which I imagine is going to be a rest day before they actually take on the Mavericks, who just defeated the Golden State Warriors in Dallas tonight. So they're playing really, really well right now. And then after that, you go home, and this homestand, it's short and it's tough. You got the Knicks and you got the Nuggets. Then you're back on the road for a game against the Jazz. And then the real painful homestand begins. You have the Bulls, Bucks, Celtics, and Suns, 4 straight in Sacramento. Very likely the Kings go 0-4 during that stretch, but we should see some good basketball in the Golden One Center. I'm looking forward to attending a couple of those games. And then on March 23rd, after that homestand, the Kings go to Indiana for their first meeting against non-Sacramento King Tyrese Halliburton. So after that, the schedule doesn't get any prettier, but we'll just focus on those next handful of games. It's going to be tough, even with tonight's win. And I know moving up a game on the San Antonio Spurs, who are still themselves a handful of games back. I think they're like 2.5 or 3 games back of the New Orleans Pelicans, who are in the 10th seed. Ultimately, it doesn't mean a ton for the Kings play-in chances, but this is another one of those situations that we talked a lot about on yesterday's pod, where it was a game where the Kings could have at least some control on their fate, and they were able to handle their business this time. Even if in the grand scheme of things, it's not super meaningless, I don't think it's going to be a game that we look back at and go, damn, if the Kings had lost that game, they would have gotten a top draft pick. I don't think it's going to come down to that. And ultimately, what we saw in this game, we saw moments in this game, especially from Darren Fox, some 2-man game moments between Fox and Sabonis, things that I want to see for this Kings team, building chemistry, building momentum heading into this offseason and heading into next season, where the playoffs are the absolute goal and the absolute expectation, and anything less would be even more of a colossal failure than much of what we've experienced this season. So I do want to hear from you, though. I want to hear your thoughts. Are you disappointed by the Kings winning this game? Are you pleased with some of the things that you saw? How would you overall rate how Darren Fox has played as of late? He's had games where his distribution is really good. His scoring has been pretty solid, a lot more consistent since the Tyrese Halliburton trade. But like in the Pelicans game, he has disappeared sometimes when it's mattered. Let me know what your thoughts are on Darren Fox. Are you to the point, if you were really down on Fox earlier, have you come around on him a little bit more? Are you back believing in him as the franchise guy, or does he still have to do more? And if so, what does he need to prove it to you this season? If you want to talk about already thoughts and expectations for this upcoming offseason, we're like 17 games away from the end of the season, believe it or not. If you want to talk about that, please do so. Whatever Kings you want to talk, send it to me at Matt @GeorgeSack on Twitter. Email me, mattgeorgesports@gmail.com. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave your thoughts in the YouTube comment section down below. I appreciate your support of the Locked On Kings podcast as always. If you're like me, a child of Arco Arena here in Sacramento, the Kings are actually doing a pretty cool event. I think it's March 17th, if I'm not mistaken, but go and look it up, and I'll talk about this more as the event gets closer. But the Kings are kind of doing a farewell to Arco Arena, which that building, that iconic building where I grew up. And I'm going to share a lot of my memories and a lot of my stories of growing up and being a kid going to Arco Arena, because that's where I fell in love with the Kings. That's where I fell in love with this fan base, and that's where I fell in love with the game of basketball. That building, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it's unfortunately going to be demolished, but it's going to, that ground is going to become, I think, like a massive hospital in the Natomas, Sacramento area, which is phenomenal. I'm glad to see that they're finally doing something with that land over there. But that building is iconic. That is really a second home to me in so many ways. So I will definitely be at that event. Would love to see you guys and to chat with many of you at that event. And again, on a future podcast, I'll start sharing many of my Arco memories and Arco stories and things that I have growing up. If you have stories, send them to me. Get ready. We're going to do a podcast just dedicated to that as that event gets closer. So make sure that you're involved in that when it happens. I appreciate you joining me again. Tomorrow, no podcast, taking a day off. We'll have a post-game podcast after the Kings and Mavericks on Saturday, so please join me for that. Until then, my name is Matt George. You have been listening to Locked On Kings, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.